Hello everyone, welcome to another Artist Loft 101 drawing class. I'm your instructor Adrienne Hodge, and I'm thrilled to be partnering with Michaels to bring you this ongoing drawing series with classes like this one that are mostly free. We do have some premium classes, usually about once a month, and while this class tonight is free, we have a class covering a similar topic on Sunday, this coming Sunday the 19th, that is a premium class. So if you haven't already registered for that class, you can find the link to register, the same place that you found this one in the list of online classes on the Michaels website. And then if you have any lingering questions after the class ends tonight, if you'd like to join me on Instagram, I will be doing a live Q&A after the class to continue the discussion from tonight's class. And so you can join me there, and I'll share my, oh, Ashley just shared it in the chat. It's at Adrienne Hodge Art on Instagram. Okay, so I'll go ahead and switch over to my tabletop view and we'll get started. So we're going to be creating a portrait using a graphite ground, which is quite the feat to try to finish in an hour here. So I'm going to zip it along as quickly as I can to hopefully get a product by the end of class that resembles this one. Before I start talking about supplies though, don't forget to tag your work that you make tonight or that you complete after watching the recording on YouTube with the hashtags Make It With Michaels or Michaels Classes. And like I said, follow me on Instagram at Adrienne Hodge Art. And then here's a couple of my business cards with some of my artwork and other places you can find me online, like Facebook. Adrienne Hodge Fine Art on Facebook. Okay, so supplies. You will need drawing paper, sketching pencils, a synthetic eraser, a kneaded eraser, the sketching set that I had linked in the supply list also comes with a few blending stumps or tortillons. You will also need a utility knife and the sandpaper block, and then a tissue or a paper towel. And you're going to want a little cup or a dish. And you might actually have 2 cups or 2 dishes. Like I've got a paper cup here to catch some of my shavings when we use the utility knife here in just a moment. And I just realized I forgot to grab a tissue, so I'm going to do that real quick. And then the dish, you're going to want to keep some graphite powder in that. So I'll show you a couple of different ways to create the graphite ground. And one of the ways is using graphite powder, and the other way will be using the side of the pencil. But before, and we're going to end up with something that looks sort of like this, and I'm going to set this aside and get my, but I'll refer to it, I'm sure, several times in the class. I've got my drawing paper here. Are there any questions about supplies before we get started, like substitutes or anything like that?
It doesn't look like we have any questions as of yet, but I will let you know if some pop up in the chat.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. And one thing that I want to mention, since I'm going to be zipping quickly past facial proportions, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about how to draw the face, because we just don't have time for it in an hour for me to cover all of that and to cover how to create a portrait using the ground here. But I did have a premium class back in October, I believe, which the only people who were sent the recording of that one on YouTube were the people who signed up for the premium class. So that's all the more reason to sign up for the premium class this Sunday, which is on portrait drawing using pen and ink. But in that class as well, I'm not going to have a whole lot of time to talk about facial proportions, but I do have a course that I created that you can find on my online shop. And I sent Ashley the link to that, so she can drop that in the chat. And if you're watching this recording on YouTube later and want to know where to find that, you can go to my Instagram at Adrienne Hodge Art and click on the link in my bio, and that'll take you to my online shop. And the class is called Portrait Drawing from Photographs, and it's a 5-hour long course that I recorded on Zoom during 2020, and it covers, the first hour of it covers basic facial proportions, and then the second hour I actually create this example here using the ground, which we're going to be doing tonight. And then the third class, I do pen and ink. The next class, I do a similar thing with graphite or charcoal on toned paper. And then the last class is using a very old grainy photo to draw using graphite. But anyway, if you're interested, there is that pretty affordable 5-hour long drawing course that covers all of that. But I'm going to just review very quickly basic facial proportions here. So there is no such thing as a perfectly proportioned head. There's no such thing as perfectly proportioned face. All of the features on every human being's head are going to vary and change depending on that person. So when I teach facial proportions, I use words like generally, thereabouts, usually, approximately, because there is no norm. But most heads are egg-shaped. So we start with an egg shape. And an easy way to find that egg shape is to draw a rectangle and then draw a circle and then a half oval off the bottom to create that egg shape. If you go halfway down from the top of your egg shape to the bottom of your egg shape, you're going to draw a horizontal line, and that's your eye line. So the average person's eyes are about halfway down their head, and that's from the crown of the head to the bottom of the chin. And I always like to balance a book on my head and say, you know, the crown of the head is up here where the book is balancing. It's not at the front of the hairline. It's way up there at the top of the head. So eye line is halfway down between the crown of the head and the bottom of the chin. And again, I know I'm going really fast here. This is like an extreme Cliff's Notes version. I just want to make sure that I touch on these points. If I'm going too fast, you can always watch the recording of this video later or look into that online course that I mentioned. Halfway down between the eye line and the bottom of the chin, we've got the nose line. And then halfway between the nose line and the bottom of the chin, we've got this line, which, you know, again, it's always an approximation. It's not exact. This line is not going to, none of these lines are going to fall in the same place on everyone's head. But you either have the little shadow underneath a person's lips, or you have the line at the center of the lips. So there's a big shadow that usually happens underneath our lips. Okay, and then I like to just designate all the highest elevated points on the head using circles. So where the light is going to hit more directly is going to be the center of the forehead, the top of the cheeks, the tip of the nose, and the chin where it protrudes. And then all the places we're going to have the shadows are going to be in the recesses of the head. So under the eyes, under the eyebrows, under the nose, under the lips, etc. And those shadows are going to change depending on the light that is falling across the person's head. Yeah, and then the ears, top of the ears tend to fall in line with the eye line. The bottom of the ears tend to fall in line with the bottom of the nose line. The center of the eye, the center of the pupil, tends to fall in line with the corner of the mouth, and that's the part in the line at the center of the mouth, not the end of the lips. So the lips may end, but the center part in the mouth will go out as wide as the line of the pupil. The tear ducts are generally in line with the edge of the nose, and the average head is about 5 of that person's eyes wide. So you should typically be able to get the width of an eye in between the eyes. And then we've got the width of the eye, and then again on the, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 eyes wide. But again, those are all generalizations. It depends on the person. And yeah, okay, that's my very speedy little review of facial proportions. Now, here is a trick that I'm just giving a sneak peek into that facial proportions class that was the premium class, but this is also on the online course that I mentioned. If you take a piece of tracing paper and you put it over the photograph that you will be drawing from, you can trace all of the heavy shadows that you're seeing on the person's face and just ignore your idea of, you know, the outlines that are around a person's eyes, nose, mouth, etc., and just look for the irregular blobby shapes, the shapes of the value, the shapes of the light, and the shapes of the dark. And if you outline those shapes and then fill those in with, I like to use a little diagonal line here, and I'm going to use this same technique in the pen and ink class on Sunday, and I'll go a little bit more in depth with this process in the pen and ink class, by the way, the premium class on Sunday. But if you fill those in, and I like to use a diagonal line to fill them in, when you take the photograph away, you should have something that really captures the essence of that photograph. So with this idea in mind is what I'm going to be applying to tonight's drawing. And this class was marketed towards intermediate students. So if anything is above your head a little bit, just, stick with it. You might be pleasantly surprised with your results because this process tends to be very forgiving, and it's a great way to learn facial proportions just by throwing yourself in the deep end and trial and error. And because we're going to be starting with this ground and then erasing out the highlights, putting the shadows back in, etc., we're going to be going back and forth with our values. I think it's very forgiving. It's a lot like painting. You're applying something, you're taking it away, you're applying it, you're taking it away. And so it leaves a lot of room for error. Okay. I'm sure there might be some questions on what I just said, but is there anything, Ashley, that looks like I could answer really quickly?
We just had a question about why your pencils are sharpened the way they are.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm about to tell you. Okay, so that was my next thing, was we're going to sharpen our pencils like this. So on the supply list tonight, I asked you to get a utility knife, and my Artist Loft brand utility knife is much sharper than the one I'm going to be using because I misplaced my Artist Loft one. But the way that we're going to be using either the side of the pencil to create our ground, or we're going to be using the graphite powder. So I've got a paper cup here, which I'm going to catch my shavings in, and then I've got this dish, this nice dish with some gold ink stained inside of it, that I'm going to be using to catch my graphite powder, because that's the other way we're going to be creating this ground. All right, so let me take one that's not sharpened this way just to show you how I did it. So, but let me do that to another B. We're going to be using a lot of our B pencils tonight. So you've got H's and B's in that drawing set. You can probably just set your H's aside because we're really going to be using the B pencils a lot more since they're so soft. Okay, so I'm gonna actually move my paper while I do this. So I'm gonna take a pencil that is not sharpened with the knife, and I'm going to start sort of far back on the pencil, like about 2 or 3 inches, and I'm going to start to make shallow cuts into it, like I'm grating cheese. And so I'm trying to remove the encasing on the pencil, so that coating, the colored coating that's on there. And once I get past that colored coating, I should just be exposing the wood. And this will take me about 3 or 4 minutes, which I don't want to spend on this, to shave this all down to where it's just the wood exposed. So I'm going to jump to one where it's already exposed quite a bit. So once you get down to where it's just the wood, you want to be really careful not to go too deep. So I said long, shallow cuts because that's the easiest way to ensure that you're not going to cut the graphite. If you go too deep, like if you point your blade, you know, perpendicular to the graphite, you're going to cut into the graphite. So keep it parallel, keep the blade parallel to the wood. So you're getting a nice shallow cut to happen every time. And it takes some practice. But once you've done that and you've exposed about an inch or two of, well, not 2 inches, probably like an inch, maybe an inch, little over an inch of the graphite, then you can take your sandpaper in your dish and you can rub your graphite against your sandpaper, and you're going to get your pencil to a nice point, which is a great way to just sharpen your pencils for drawing, because you can get a lot of line variation with this. You can get thicker lines, you can get thinner lines, and then it helps your pencil last a longer time as well, because you don't have to sharpen it as often. And then the other wonderful side effect is, if we do this and we're careful to, you know, keep our shavings separate, like this from the graphite powder, then we can get a nice little pile of graphite powder going, and we can use that to create our ground. So I'm just, I mean, this is plenty sharp enough. I'm really just continuing to do it because I want to get a nice amount of graphite powder. So maybe let me do that to a different one. Any questions about sharpening the pencil this way?
Allie had a question, whether they could use water-soluble graphite.
Yeah, that's fine.
Awesome.
I'm not going to be adding any water to this one, obviously, but
Right.
you want to hold off on doing that, just because the process of what I'm like adding any water, I mean, like just use them the way I'm going to be using them, just because we're going to be erasing back into this ground quite a bit. And if you add water, it's going to be harder to erase out your highlights.
Yep. And then we had one request, if you could pull the camera out a little, like zoom out a little bit. I don't know if that's possible, but that was the other thing.
For how I'm sharpening with the blade. Unfortunately, I can't because I'm using a document camera, but I can just take my cup away and do it a little lower so you can see. So I'm starting parallel to the pencil, shallow cuts, and it's kind of hard for, like, you know, to show you and get the right angle that I want with my hands without, you know, holding my hands differently. So yeah, if you've ever, you know, whittled wood, it's basically what you're doing. You're just whittling the wood down. So it takes some practice. You want to cut away from yourself. And yeah, is that helpful enough to see how I'm doing that? Long, shallow cuts. Once you've got a lot of the wood exposed, the wood's going to be a lot softer. It's harder to get that coating off, but the farther back you start on the coating, the easier it is to get a nice long shallow cut to happen. And I've done this before in other classes. I believe it was the class on, well, the other class on Creed drawing using a graphite ground, where we drew just a lemon back in the early days of this series. And I'm sure I spent a little bit more time in that class, but I just want to move it along here since we've got so much to cover and we're already 20 minutes in. Okay, so, and I accidentally got some of my shavings in my little dish. I was trying to keep them separate. Okay, so I've got my graphite powder and I'm just clearing off my desk. I've made my hands nice and messy now. All right, so the easiest way to make this this ground is to just dump this powder onto the page and use the powder. But if you didn't have the utility knife or the sandpaper, or if you possibly have a graphite stick, we basically just created a graphite stick out of our sketching pencils because we exposed so much of the graphite. So you want to use one of your B pencils that's sharpened like this. You might be able to, well, no, you're gonna have a tricky time doing it with it just sharpened small like that. So but I'm taking my maybe your 4B or your 5B, and you're just gonna lightly use the side of it to sketch a nice medium tone. So not a lot of pressure on it because you don't want the front of the pencil to press down. You want to get a smooth, continuous blend to happen. So I'm using just the side of that pencil that's been exposed so much like that to begin to create our ground, or you can just dump that powder on there. And then take your tissue and start to lightly move that around. And that's a much faster way to get a ground to happen. So it's called a ground because it's smooth and even and one tone, and the ground is usually one even continuous thing. So same thing with the tone and music. It's a continuous thing, right? So we've got a nice tone or ground started here on the page, and you can continue adding graphite powder or using the side of your pencil until you've blended a nice medium tone. But if you're good and then you're ready to get started, like me, that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so I'm using this photograph in the supply list. I told you to have a highly contrasted photo with, so if it's highly contrasted, you're gonna have strong highlights and strong shadows. I suggested black and white because it's just easier to see the shift in light to dark that way. And forward facing is like a picture of a person that's forward facing is easiest because then we don't have to worry about a head tilt or things like that when we're just talking about a forward facing person. The facial proportions are pretty straightforward, pun intended. Okay, so I'm gonna try to have my photograph slightly visible, but mostly it's gonna be off screen. And I've used, like I said in that online course that I used this photograph. I use this photograph a lot. I'll be using this photograph again for the pen and ink example on Sunday as well, the premium class using pen and ink, just because it's a highly contrasted photo of myself, and I find self-portraits are a great way to practice portrait drawing, because when you're drawing a portrait of someone, we have, we want it to look good, right? And we want it to look like that person. And if we're trying to draw a person who is precious to us, or, a loved one or a partner or a grandparent, etc., we tend to have this automatic audience that we're trying to satisfy. But when we're drawing ourselves, usually by a certain age, you're okay with making yourself look bad, right? So if it turns out not to your liking or to your expectations, then at least you don't have to worry about this audience member who's waiting for this portrait of them, right? And it's a little easier to manage your expectations with yourself. So that's why I like to use self-portraits anytime I'm doing demos like this. The other thing I like to use is pictures of interesting characters off the internet. So maybe a celebrity or you know, someone who you find interesting looking, more of like a character. Think, you know, the comedic relief in a movie, not the leading character, because then maybe we're not trying to make that person look so pretty, right? Or perfectly proportioned like they might be. If it's an interesting character, then we can kind of focus more on our drawing skills and not making the person look, you know, necessarily pretty. Okay, anyway, moving on. That's just my psychology that goes into why I like to use the subjects that I do in practicing this way. All right, so we're going to start with the highlights in our image, and we're going to erase out all of the highlights. And if you don't get this exact the first time, that's okay. You can always just fill the ground back in. So say that you erase something and you're like, oh, that's not where I want it. Then all you got to do is take your pencil or your graphite powder and fill that back in. And then, you know, you've got a clean slate and you're ready to start over. The other reason I think starting with a tone can be so helpful is because it's not a blank piece of paper. And psychologically speaking, again, sometimes we can be very intimidated by the blank piece of paper. Okay, I realize that just came out a little darker than the rest of it. I'm going to use that to my advantage. I'm shifting the highlight up a little higher, and I'm going to use that as the shadow of my eye. So I'm basically just using my synthetic eraser to draw into this ground or tone and start to create my highlighted shapes. Not really worrying about anything other than that right now. So in using that tracing paper method that I showed you is a great way to kind of check yourself against that. And you can see all of those areas where you didn't add a shadow. Those are all the places where you're erasing out your highlights. So I've got the top of the cheek here. Here's the cheekbone. And this is the highlight on the forehead and under the bangs. And yeah, my proportions might not be exact right now. They might be close enough. And if they're not, then I just fill the ground back in and try again. But like I said, I find this to be a really forgiving method. Okay, now I am at the part underneath my nose, above the lips here. And then the lips are all pretty dark, but then I've got the chin. It's pretty highlighted. All right, is that creepy enough for you guys? So you're going to end up with this sort of ghost image of all of the highlights. All right, so that might not be exactly where I want things to be, but I am going to just guide myself around here through trial and error. Right, so now I'm going to start to put in the heavier shadows, but I'm going to resist the urge to draw with the front of my pencil, and I'm going to kind of pretend I'm still using the chunky eraser method. So I'm going to use all the different parts of this exposed pencil just to try to fill in the blobby shape. So the same idea as the erasing out the highlights. I'm just looking for the big blobby shadowy shapes. And you can use as little or less pressure as you want here. the more pressure that you use, the harder it might be to erase. But if it just gets super dark, you can always just make your ground, your whole ground, a little darker. And I have a feeling I'm going to find that my proportions are not, I'm going to have to tweak some things here, but I'm just going for it. And I encourage you to just go for it too. This is the exact same way we drew that lemon in the class on, it was called tonal shading with and without a ground. And it's pretty easy to find on YouTube. Tonal shading with and without a ground. If the head is frustrating you too much tonight and you want to approach this same method using something like a piece of fruit, then you can go check that class out and then come back to this one maybe. I don't know, the more I'm looking at it, I think this might be okay. Maybe I did get the proportions kind of all right here. We'll see. All right, so I'm on the lips. But actually, before I do the lips too much, let me see if I got the nose in the right spot into that heavy shadow underneath the nose. But notice I'm not trying to outline, you know, any of the parts of my features. And if the synthetic eraser erases out too much, you can use the kneaded eraser that comes in this set instead. You can take your kneaded eraser and, you know, stretch it out and get it to be at a nice little point, and it's a little easier to kind of blend into when you're erasing. The synthetic eraser will get you a nice sharp highlight to happen. The kneaded eraser will help you to get some soft erasing to happen. All right, and I've been using my 6B this whole time. I'm gonna switch to my 2B, or maybe just my B, because this shadow on the side of my nose is a little lighter here. So I don't need such a heavy pencil. Maybe I'll just stick to this side of my face for a minute so I can keep the reference photo on the screen at the same time. So I'm really just looking at this half of my face. This half. With the very strong shadow on the cheekbones here. Okay, and then there's a little bit of a lighter shadow on my lips. So again, I don't need such a heavier pencil there. And I'm using a very smooth, continuous little circular motion as I add my shading. Using the lighter B pencil to get the shapes the way you want them is a good way to, you know, just not go so dark. And then once you're pretty confident of your placement of your shadows, then you can go back in with the 6B and darken them. Since we're not spending a whole lot of time tonight on basic facial proportions, and we're just focusing on this using the ground technique, you know, be very forgiving with yourself if you're not capturing a likeness. Make your goal to just try to capture a realistic person, a realistic portrait. So the shadows and light are convincing. And try not to worry too much about if it looks exactly like that person. Okay, now I'm going to get a little more exact with some of my highlights here using my kneaded eraser. Can start to define the shape of the eye a little bit more. And the highlights around the eye. Same thing with the side of the nose. And then the more I look at this, I think I need to make this shadow come up a little bit higher right here. Make it a little more severe. Okay. Now I'm looking at the shadow underneath the lips. And I've yet to point my pencil down at the paper. I'm really just using the side of my pencil so that everything that I'm putting on is kind of sitting on the surface of the paper, and it's going to be easy to erase if I want to take anything away. All right, I think that side of the head's looking pretty good. I got the shadow on the side of my chin here. And get a little bit more of the hair going. There's a class I have planned in January on drawing hair coming up using colored pencil. I'm going to start to break down more and more parts of portrait drawing in this series going forward. So there's a class on drawing tips and tricks for drawing the eye at the end of January. And then, yeah, actually it's February as the hair drawing class that's planned. I don't think that's up on the website just yet, but that will be in the new year. Okay, I think I'm ready to work on the other side of the head here. I'm going to have to move my reference photo a little bit. Let me see if I can maybe do this so it's still visible there. But that just kind of distorts it. How about that? Okay. I apologize to anybody who's trying to use my reference photo. I realize it might be tricky. It's gonna be much easier if you're using your own reference photo, but then all your shapes are going to be different than mine, but just, you know, use the same idea of what I'm doing here. So find all of your heaviest shadows now, and once you've designated all your highlighted shapes, we're just doing the same thing. And the best way to approach something like this is, you know, just be as non-committal as possible. Like, don't look at every line that you're putting down when you're approaching a portrait this way as sacred. I mean, that's the whole purpose of using a method like this, is that it's so easy to take things away. Like if I had just laid down that whole big shadow and then realized that that was not where I wanted it to be, you know, just like I did at the very beginning, I can erase all of that out, put some more medium tone down, blend it with my tissue paper, and then I've got, you know, pretty much what I started with on that tone. And using the tone means that your medium values are already there. That tone that we put down at the start here acts as, you know, the mid-tone. The mid-tone is already there in the portrait. So you really just have to focus on the highlights and the dark shadows. Are there any questions at this point, Ashley? Jumping out?
We had a question about the numbers on the pencils. I tried to explain it in the chat, but basically the B being soft and the H being hard, going out from the middle there.
Yeah, and the very first class that I ever did in this series was called Intro to Graphite Pencils and Drawing Forms. And we actually did that class twice. So that's very easy to find in the Artist Loft series on YouTube as well, because we did the class twice in July and then again in August. And I really break down the differences between all of the graphite pencils. But yeah, exactly. The B is your softer pencils for your darker values, and the H pencils are hard. The H stands for hard. The B stands for black. I like to say the B stands for butter to help me remember that it's soft compared to the H pencil. But yeah, exactly like Ashley said, it's all of your B pencils are going to be for your darker values, your softer values, and then your H pencils are going to be for your lighter values. But since we created that mid-tone, and as much as we're erasing into it, it kind of like naturally blends the highlighted tones, the lighter tones. So I think you can really get away with doing most of what we're doing tonight with the B pencils and your erasers. Okay, so yeah, I'm still just using my 6B. I've mainly just used my 6B and I think a B. So a 2B and a 6B would be two good pencils that would get you through most of this exercise, because you just want something for your lighter shadows and then something for those heavier shadows. And then the eraser kind of naturally does a lot of the blending for you. Right, I'm making pretty good time here, but in about 5 minutes, I'm going to start to work on some of the crisper details in my portrait here. So, but I'm definitely want to emphasize that, spending a lot of times, a lot of the time, focusing on getting your values to match these heavier areas of dark and light, and don't worry about the specific details for a while. That's called the general to specific method. So we're working very general, and then we're going to make it more specific. So we're letting this portrait really emerge from this mid-tone. Get my big area of the hair going here. This heavier shadow on the side of the face. I just noticed Ashley's response in the chat. So yeah, and in that other class, I go into a lot of detail about this, and I even have a little diagram that I made to help understand. But the higher the numbers, the softer the pencil is. So your 6B is going to be softer than your 2B, and it's going to be naturally darker. There's also a class called Lines and Tones in this series. And all of these are on YouTube. If you just search, the keywords and these class titles that I'm mentioning in the Artist Loft, they're very easy to find. But there was a class on lines and tones where I go through all of the pencils in the Artist 101 drawing set the pencils, the charcoal, pretty much every material that comes in that set. And I talk about creating lines and tones and how, you know, you really can get almost as dark with a, you know, 4B as you can with a 6B. It's just a different quality of the line and the tone. So I kind of go through all of the pencils and just, you know, compare and contrast them in that way by just creating a series of lines and tones with each material in that set. And so you can really see how it's all about the amount of pressure that you're putting on the pencil and the way that you're using it. Yes, you can get a darker tone with a 6B, but you can get, you know, the same kind of almost pretty close with a 4B. It's just, it's going to be a different quality to the tone, like I said. But you definitely can't get as dark with a H pencil as you can with the B pencils. The H pencils are really for your very light values and more for sketching in the early stages. And that's where that class on Intro to Graphite Pencils and Drawing Forms is a good reference for all of that. Okay, so I think I'm ready to start get more specific with, I've got like all the general shadows, and I'm very happy that I've pretty much gotten the proportions where I want them in my first pass here, because that would have been very time consuming if I had to, you know, erase out and, you know, try to get the cheek shapes and everything to match a little better. And you may be needing to, you know, do that. You may need to erase out to get your shapes and everything to match. Might take quite a bit of time, but just embrace, you know, that practice. If it's taking you longer to get there, then that's no big deal. It's just going to take a little longer to get there. It's going to be that much more rewarding when you do. But now I can start to look at where these, you know, detailed moments are happening, like these very interesting highlights that are happening on the lips or at the edge of the eyes. And I can start to put those shapes in. And if you have a white chalk pastel, that could be helpful too, for pushing these highlights. If your tone got super dark, you know, you can kind of blend with a white chalk pastel as well, but erasing out those highlights works just fine too. And this is where I always just have to point out when I'm drawing myself, and if anybody else, you know, happened to take a screenshot of my reference photo and is drawing from my reference photo, all the ways that our facial features, you know, might be asymmetrical or much different than other people, are all the ways that, you know, make us look like us. So my face is not symmetrical. One of my sides of my lip is a little higher than the other one, and my nose is a little off center as well. So when I'm drawing myself, I always have to make sure that I get that, you know, asymmetry to happen, because that's how I'm going to capture my likeness. So that's why I was saying drawing interesting characters can be fun, as opposed to drawing somebody who, you know, meets the typical standards of conventional beauty in our society, because what we tend to label as beautiful in society tends to be the most symmetrical. And so we might have a urge to, you know, fix asymmetries on a person's face. And then the more we do that, the more we're getting away from making it look like that particular person. So the way to capture likeness is to, you know, really get those imperfections, quote unquote imperfections, included in your drawing. You know, notice where that person's face is different than everybody else's face. Okay, so I'm just getting more specific with my eye shadows here. And there's a crisp line of a shadow on my eyelid right there. But I'm really letting the shapes of the shadows guide me around here. Like I'm looking at where that line is in relationship to the heavier shadow above it, not where I think an eyelid should go. You know, I'm using my reference photo and where those shadows are occurring in the photo to guide me around. And then I'm just going darker where I see that it goes darker within that shadow, and that starts to make the pupil come to life there. Put some of these eyelashes in and things like that. Tear duct. And if you need some practice, you know, drawing different types of anatomy, you can stay tuned for this series because, like I said, I'll have like a class on drawing the eye. I plan to have a class at some point soon on breaking down the nose, breaking down the lips. But so far in the plan, I've got eyes in January, hair in February, probably do the nose next in March, and then lips later on, maybe in April. Don't hold me to that. I'm still planning as I go forward, but yeah, I'm trying to get different drawing materials and not, you know, always do a graphite class, but graphite is definitely a good gold standard. All right. So it is about 6:53. I'm going to just keep working on my specific details here, and then I'd love to see what some of the folks in the class have done as well. Hopefully you've got some progress made. It's okay if yours isn't, you know, as far along as mine at this point. But hopefully you'll keep going and you can, you know, share your results with me on social media, or you can even email your finished portraits to me if you don't want to post, but you still want to share it with me. My email is here on my business card. It's just adrianhodge@gmail.com. Yeah, it seems like whenever I've done classes that are more individualized like this, like you're using your individual photo of a person, or like the tree class, I got a lot of wonderful examples emailed to me afterwards. I love to see them. Even if you don't post to social media, feel free to share them with me like that. Okay, so yeah, just continue this push and pull between the dark values and the light values, and then when I feel ready, when I feel like I've gotten that shape where I want it to be, then I can use the front part of the pencil, you know, to really dig in some lines there and lay them down a little heavier. If you go in with the front of your pencil too soon, you're going to find that it's going to be harder to lift it back out with the eraser and to blend back into it. So that's kind of the main reason why I was encouraging you to use the side of your pencil early on, like I was, and go general to specific that way, because once you use the sharper point on the pencil, it's harder to erase out those lines and those marks. All right, I'm gonna switch back to my other example there. And I'd love to see some of y'all's work so far. Does anybody have a nice result that they'd like to share at this point? Oh, wow, look at that, Monica. I love it. Really nice. Oh, look, it's me. Marsha, that's great. Really nice. So fun. Oh, and Terry drew me as well. Oh, you guys are really capturing my likeness too. Oh, these are so fun. Yes, please share these on social media so I can share them with my people. Oh, Lois, I love that. Love how dark your values are getting. And Allie, oh, that nose and lips really come into life. I love how soft you're blending there. Very nice, Kylie. Look at those lips. Those are really softly blended. Oh, Christina, that's so bold. I love the lines that you're using, but it's still nice and loose and very nice. Lori, really nice. Yeah, just keep going with that blending and pushing and pulling with those shadows and highlights. Is that everyone? All right, cool. Well, thank you all so much. And yeah, if anybody would like to, well, are there any questions? Because we still have, oh, somebody was asking, when do we use the tortillion? Haha, I didn't use my tortillions at all. I like to save the tortillions for the end, just because sometimes they can kind of really bury your lines into the paper, and then it's harder to erase back out again. But once you're pretty, you know, confident that you've got things where you want them to be, then the tortillion can just act as another way to blend. I think the eraser, you know, is kind of my favorite blending tool. But oh, I realized I'm working on that example instead of this one. But also for those mid-tones, you know, if you want to use your tortillion with a little bit of graphite on it instead of like your lighter B pencil, that can be really good. And it can, you know, get some of these lighter values to happen really soft. I mean, I'm probably lying when I say that it buries them into the page. It's still pretty easy to erase it back out if it's, so yeah, you might find that the tortillion is a more forgiving way to lay down certain values. I just, for whatever reason, it's just my personal preference. I sometimes think that the tortillion can over blend things. Like maybe I just get a little too, and maybe a lot of you can relate. Like when I get the tortillion in my hand, I just like keep blending and I have a hard time using restraint. And then I'm like, oh, I had a nice subtle shift between light and dark happening there. And then I just over blended it with the tortillion. So it's just, you know, I don't know. I prefer not to use them so much, but they're definitely great and they're definitely nice to use for this because you can get a lot of different values without pressing, you know, down too hard with your pencil. So like maybe, you know, putting a lighter shadow back in on my lips right here would be good using, you know, because the graphite will get stuck to the tortillion and then it makes it easier to fill in without pressing down so hard. Yeah, that's really nice right there. Okay, so yeah, thank you. Good question about the tortillion. I'm glad somebody said that so that I could sometimes totally forget about them. Because it's just my personal preference. It's like the fan brush, you know, some people love their fan brush when they're painting. I have never used a fan brush in my life, but I know some people love it. Oh, I just totally messed up the top of my lips there. Oh well. Any other questions before we go? Well, it's 7 o'clock now. My tortillion rambling got us to 7. Okay, well, if anybody has any more lingering questions, you can join me on my Instagram live. And if you're watching this recording on YouTube later and you want to check out the live Q&A from Instagram tonight, it should be up on my Instagram tomorrow, on my IGTV, or even after the the live session tonight, I will share it there. So you cannot sharpen the tortillons to get the graphite off, but you can just rub them on a blank piece of paper to try to get all the graphite off and to get them clean again. I like to designate tortillons for, you know, light and dark. That way some of them don't get quite so dark. All right, well, thank you all so much for joining me for another wonderful Michael's class. Hopefully I'll see you this Sunday in the portrait drawing using pen and ink. I'll be using the same reference photo and a lot of the same ideas, but just using pen and ink. And that's a premium class, but it's pretty affordable, and hopefully you guys will sign up. All right, thank you and have a good evening.